Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the latest edition of the ESG Show. And welcome from sunny the UK, where it's a bright, warm day today. The ESG Show, if you're new to it, is a weekly event in which we talk about recent topical developments in the world of ESG, and we explore some topics in more depth. And today I'm going to be joined by Shelle Fantastic, who is going to be co-hosting the show with me. Shelle has over 25 years of professional experience in mental health services and is passionate about leadership and well-being. During the lockdown, she founded her own company with a strong focus on empowering women in business, combining her expertise in mental health with an entrepreneurial spirit. Shelle aims to bridge the gap between personal and professional development, helping women achieve their goals while maintaining a healthy work-life balance.
Hi there. Thank you for that great introduction, Michael, and thank you for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here with you again.
Fantastic, Shelle. Fantastic, Shelle, fantastic. And today we're going to be talking about a number of issues, including the Emperor's New Clothes. We're going to be talking about AI in ESG and barriers to sustainability.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm sure all our viewers are appropriately dressed today in wonderful new clothes, as am I. And yeah, we've got some really great conversation today, haven't we? I know, like you said, Michael, there we're talking about AI and ESG, and also the big one, practical steps in implementing sustainability.
Practical steps indeed. Well, we're also being joined this morning by Swetam, Swetam Gungah. And Swetam has over 20 years of professional experience in education and financial services. He is an executive coach and ESG consultant, and he is an advocate of sustainability and technology. He's worked with large corporates, asset managers, and asset and hedge funds globally on a range of topics across factor investing, sustainable investment, and regulatory measures. Most recently, he has helped launch an ESG platform that provides a holistic view on ESG and climate-related metrics. He's also worked as a consultant for the University of Southampton to advise on hydrogen as an alternative to fossil fuels. Good morning, Swetam.
Hey, hello, Michael. Good morning. Hello, everyone. And thank you for this wonderful introduction. And I'm really pleased to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So you're a bit of an advocate of hydrogen then. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is indeed. Hydrogen is a potential, alternative to fossil fuel. But for this to happen, there needs to be a number of conditions in place.
So, okay, so there's different types of hydrogen. There's hydrogen you can generate from coal, which I believe is called brown hydrogen, from gas, which I think is called blue hydrogen, or from renewables, which is called green hydrogen. Presumably you're talking about green hydrogen here.
Yeah, but in any case, I think, at this stage we are right now, it's still very early days in terms of production of hydrogen. We need all the stakeholders to come together and to be aligned in terms of how we move to a greener version of hydrogen, moving away from the black, brown, and so forth. Governments, corporates, the utility sectors, financial sector, everyone really has to come together and think of how we can make this into a viable, economically viable and also environmentally friendly source of energy.
Yeah, I think one of the issues with hydrogen is the cost of generating it, but also the cost of transporting it as well.
Indeed, but before then, we need data. We need lots and lots of data to understand, how it's being produced, how it's being stored and distributed and consumed, because that's where the expert can then come in and, just use the data to come up with smart ways to turn hydrogen into this viable source of energy. We can sort of guess in a way how we can deploy that globally, but unless we actually put it in practice and start on a small scale, we don't really know what the challenges are.
Okay, so it's subject to a kind of like a learning rate. So, 40 years ago, the cost of energy from solar power was enormous. It was prohibitive, and now I believe it is possibly, arguably, the cheapest form of generating energy in the world. So I suppose hydrogen could be subject to a similar kind of cost curve.
Absolutely right. It's the economy of scale. The more we grow, the cheaper it will become eventually.
Okay, well, look, I think hydrogen is a fascinating topic, but this is not the hydrogen show, it's the ESG show, so we must swiftly move on, but maybe hydrogen is a topic we can return to in a future episode. Shelle, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Swetam. That was really, really fascinating, and definitely and one for another day, I think, definitely. So I'm here with Chris Mentor today. He is the co-founder of Getting to Zero, a consulting firm that helps Australian businesses measure and report their GHG emissions and forecast their journey to a zero emissions world. A 20-year veteran of enterprise performance management, he is now applying enterprise scale planning, reporting and analysis to the ESG space. Whew. Hi there. Hi, Chris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So yeah, Chris, how is everything over there in your part of the world? How is everything going? It's it's interesting, isn't it? Country for net zero, Australia. Although the politicians, I believe, are quite controversial on this. And isn't Australia especially well placed to take advantage of renewables?
Yeah, well, look, it's interesting. We had an election here 12 months ago, and we've had very little action or momentum in the space of ESG and renewables, but that has dramatically changed. So it's like a plug has been released, and there's all this energy has come forward. And there is huge momentum towards actually getting to net zero as fast as we can. And in Australia here, we've got about 45% of AX 200 companies, which is like the top 200 companies on the Australian Stock Exchange, with net zero commitments by 2050. So not highly ambitious right now, but there are some front runners. So for example, the property developer Lendlease is aiming for absolute zero, not net zero, but absolute zero by 2040. And Fortescue Metals Group, who digs iron ore out of the ground and sells it to China, are looking to get to net zero across its entire value chain by 2040. So, we're a country with a lot of high emitting industries like mining and refining. And much more needs to be done by Australian large businesses. And I think we're just starting. I think we're in a good place, but we've got a lot to do.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and something that I'd love to learn so much more about. I think there's so much more to that, isn't there, as well? So thank you for that. Now we come to the part of the show where we review news stories.
Indeed. And now there's something that's caught my attention this week, which is about classical music, women in classical music. Shelle, over to you.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating that I saw an article, and there's partnerships happening in a quite a huge way, and really looking at leveling up the playing field, I guess, for women, particularly in classical music, something that I'm sure our audience perhaps some of our audience perhaps weren't aware of. So it's really fascinating, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of classical music composers, I think of Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert and all that gang. I don't think of female composers, but apparently there are some very, very good female composers out there, and for some reason we don't hear about them.
Absolutely, it's and it's true. It's something that I hadn't, in all honesty, given an awful lot of thought to until I'd seen this article, and I think it's definitely worth a deeper dive, and definitely something that clearly we need to address, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. But it's not just classical music, isn't it? If you think about it, if you think about rock and pop, yeah, I know there are some massive female artists, Madonna being an obvious one, but actually the majority of them are male. You know, Elvis, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Michael Jackson. Why is that? There's no reason for that. There's no reason that I can think of why there should be. I mean, we all know that there are plenty. If you look at classical musical orchestras, there's plenty of women in the orchestras. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, it's definitely makes you think, doesn't it? You know, it's very thought provoking, and like I say, something that, you know, obviously clearly needs to be addressed. It's obviously a much bigger issue than you know, perhaps some of our audience realised. Certainly, I think than I had realised. You know, so it's very fascinating. So our next story comes to mind now, which is cash for carbon.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to quickly summarize to you the essence of this story, which is essentially that it's about that big controversy, which is the issue of cash for carbon. And it's not what you might think, or maybe it is what you might think if you're cynical about it. The article in question says the past 2 weeks has seen a flurry of big deals in carbon removal. Chase announced this week that it will be pre-purchasing 600,000 plus tons of carbon removal for $200 million plus from several carbon removal companies. Last week, Frontier, a coalition of companies that makes advanced market commitments in the carbon removal space, pre-purchased 112,000 tons of carbon removal from Chain Industries for $53 million. Also, last week, Microsoft pre-purchased 2.7 million tons of carbon capture by Ørsted from their bioenergy with carbon capture and energy units. Chris, Swetam, any thoughts about this story?
Look, I think there is the industry around carbon credits is growing nearly geometrically. I mean, the demand is enormous, and I think the thing that I think the world has to be careful of is that we don't cut corners with this, and that it's managed properly. The other thing with my other thoughts really just on BECCS and also direct air capture, which is a similar type of technology, but capturing directly out of the air, is I think in theory the technology works or looks good. It still needs to be completely proven. But the International Energy Agency reported last year that 45.9 megatons had been pulled out of the atmosphere, of CO2 had been pulled out of the atmosphere, and had forecast this to rise to 253 megatons by 2030. But in contrast, last year, the world emitted 36.8 gigatons of carbon. So the difference is absolutely enormous. So we're nowhere near the scale yet for it to make a huge difference in our climate.
Sounds like bow and arrows against lightning to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Very interesting indeed. Thank you for that. Shelley.
Yeah, so I think we've got, and that is actually very interesting as well. And it's just staggering, isn't it? But we have two more studies that we need to discuss very quickly, I think, everyone. And there's this one in The Guardian that I noticed as well. The recycled plastic can be more toxic and is not to fix, and is no fix to pollution. I mean, yeah, just look at that. I mean, it's just absolutely staggering, isn't it?
It's stunning.
It really is. It really is. And you know, and we have another one. You know, solar power due to overtake oil production investment for the first time. The EA says. You know, so you know, there's so much happening, isn't there? So many studies and everything. It's just fascinating. You could spend a long time looking into that, couldn't you, and discussing it as well. So Yeah, any thoughts on that, Michael, or our guests?
Well, I mean, it's good and bad, isn't it? I mean, I'm incredibly excited about what's just happening with solar. I think it's wonderful that solar is developing so quickly. Plastic, well, you know, so it has a creature has evolved, hasn't it, that can actually eat plastic, I believe. Maybe that's our big hope. Chris, Swetam, any thoughts on these stories?
Well, the story here, with regards to recycling plastic, is that it isn't compatible with, sustainability and with a circular economy. Let me ask you a question here very quickly, Michael. How much plastic do you think has been recycled so far?
A very, very small percentage, I would imagine. Probably significantly less than 1%, I'm guessing.
Well, we've done a bit more than that. We've done about 9% of all plastics that's been produced since the 1950s, and that's about 8 billion tons of plastic. So 9% of that has been recycled, which begs the question, really, what's happened to the rest of it? But the irony with recycled plastic is that we end up with higher and higher concentration of toxic materials, chemicals in the recycled plastic. So, we're not really helping the environment by recycling in that sense, because we're adding more and more concentrated toxic back into the ecosystem. So that's one thing. Now, a recent report by Greenpeace has shown that the recycled plastic is actually reintroducing these pollutants, and it's harming not just human life but the entire biodiversity. So the point here, we have to stop producing plastic in the first place and not think of recycling as the solution. But the good news is a number of countries have realize the risk of that. So next week in Paris, we have about 170 representatives of different countries coming together to discuss a treaty that will legally bind them on the full life cycle of plastic from production to disposal. So we're moving in the right direction, and have 2 years to come up with that treaty. So there's hope.
Yeah, there is a problem too with plastic, is that we need to have a price signal sent to businesses around virgin plastic, which is new plastic, versus older or upcycle or recycled plastic. And the problem right now is that the virgin plastic is so much cheaper than recycling existing plastic. So if there was some sort of price signal by way of a tax or something else that made virgin plastic more expensive, that could change at least corporate behavior in terms of the cost benefit ratio of using new raw plastic, and maybe help in the resistance. But I don't think there's one solution to this. I think it's one part of many things that we could actually do to reduce the plastic use over time.
Okay. What about the solar story, Chris? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's really positive. I think there is a global momentum around, especially around solar and wind and batteries, that are just absolutely unstoppable. It is, and I think the big reason why it is becoming so big is that it can be built out so quickly, so fast. So if building a normal like a coal-fired power station, you've got to get approvals, you've got to build the thing, and then you've got to dig stuff out of the ground to fire it. And that can take years from end to end to get going. Whereas solar, you just need some flat ground, you put in solar panels connected to the grid, and you're immediately producing. So the return on investment for investors is so much faster for especially solar, but even with wind, compared to other methods of energy production. So I think that's one of the reasons why it is becoming so big.
Okay, thanks for that, Chris. We've had a little bit of a discussion's been going on with the audience here on the subject of recycling. Is recycling the solution? Maybe we should just need to stop plastic altogether. Swetam, I think you've got some thoughts about that.
Well, that's what we used to think, that recycling is the way forward. But unfortunately, as been demonstrated, there's, the thing about some chemicals within plastic that aren't really being, disposed of properly. So it ends up again in the entire ecosystem. So we're not really addressing the real issue here. Yes, recycling is good, but it's not the right way forward, as we found out.
Thank you very much for that, guys. That was really interesting. Incidentally, we are joined by viewers from Botswana, Ireland, India, Kosovo, among other countries. And Chris, there's one thing I think that all those people, those countries have, which is different from Australia, which is they don't have a prime minister that takes a lump of coal into parliament with them.
Thank goodness. I'm glad they don't.
Okay, so before we move on, I just thought I'd say a few words about next week's ESG. It's being broadcast at the same time, and we have another great lineup of guests, and we will be discussing ESG, the ultimate silo buster. And our guests will be Josh Jacobson, CEO of Next Stage, a US-based social impact company, Natalie Runyon from Thomson Reuters, an expert onto the intersection of culture and ESG, and Jonathan Ha, founder of Seneca, a business intelligence company focusing on corporate sustainability assessment and reporting. So watch this space, or at least our LinkedIn group, for more. So anyway, we hope you are enjoying the show. To make this the ESG show a success, we do need your help. So if you wish to appear as a guest speaker, or if you're interested in partnering with us on a more commercial level, then please email me at info@techopian.com.
Fabulous. Yes, do join us and do follow us and be part of this amazing show, because it's just fascinating, isn't it? And I love that we have people from all around the world as well join us. It's just amazing to see. So thank you to everybody. So Michael, now we move on, and what are your thoughts on what we've discussed so far today?
Yeah, everything's good. I'm interested in the hydrogen discussion. I'd like to return to that at some point in the future. But now we're moving on to that stage in the show when we speak to our guests on a one-to-one basis. And now I'm going to talk to Swetam. Swetam, we're going to talk about two topics. First off, sustainable growth, and then we're going to talk about AI and ESG. So Swetam, are sustainability and growth compatible with each other?
Well, Michael, the short answer is no. You see, sustainability and growth aren't compatible. And there are different names for it. Some call it, green growth. But the point is, we live in a finite world with finite resources. So we cannot keep on exploiting them in the name of sustainability. There's sort of constant focus on growth and more growth that has to stop somewhere. At some point we need to think of a degrowth, sort of kind of scale down a little bit in terms of how much we keep on producing and consuming. And one measure of economic growth or success is GDP, but the GDP doesn't really take into consideration the environmental and social impact. It's just literally looking at how the economy is growing, regardless of the impact we have on other elements of society. So we cannot assume that an ever-increasing GDP is going to be compatible with a sustainable economy.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think that the problem with, there's a couple of issues with GDP. One thing, it doesn't measure happiness, which perhaps is more important than wealth. But I sometimes wonder whether there's a fundamental problem with how we measure GDP. If you compare it with, say, a company result, when a company issues its profit and loss, it also has a balance sheet. And the balance sheet looks at depreciation on assets, and that's reflected in the profit and loss. Now, we have some amazing free assets on this planet, like clean air, fresh water. I suppose that's not free necessarily, but it's there, and aesthetics, the aesthetic joy in nature. And maybe if those things depreciate in value, if the air is no longer quite so clean, then that should be reflected into depreciation in those assets, shouldn't it? So maybe the problem isn't so much that growth in GDP is a bad thing, it's growth in how we measure GDP that's the bad thing.
Yeah, so we need to rethink what we call GDP and what does it really measure, and what do we actually value in terms of our well-being and the quality of life. So the GDP as a measure of economic success and the real worth of a nation, I think now is no longer valid. But all of this is not really new. You see, Michael, back in the 60s, 70s, the narrative was very much around sustainability and not so much a focus on GDP. But then in the 80s, our focus changed. It switched from sort of thinking holistically and globally about the environment to being sort of narrowly focused on unlimited growth, and GDP being the measure of that. So we need to kind of take a step back and kind of go back to how we used to approach how nations develop and what well-being means for everyone.
Okay, but then there might be an argument to say that in the West, we've made it. We're wealthy countries. Okay, maybe we don't need to grow. Maybe we need to focus more on happiness or whatever. But for other parts of the world, which have not developed to that extent, they might turn around and say, well, that's a bit rich. Tell us that we can't grow anymore after you've had 200 years of economic growth.
Yes, and that's again the word grow. We can still be a developed nation without thinking of growing the economy. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but there are a number of economists that have come up with new systems, new ways of thinking in terms of growing a country, developing the nation, the state. So, where you value, again, quality of life and more the societal issues and the environment than a purely economic element of growth. So there are ways for this to happen where you raise the social measures, but not so much damage or downplay the economic factor. So we need to kind of rebalance things. And for those who kind of overshoot that limit of growth, they can now come up with ways that can help these developing countries to reach that level without harming the environment or having any sort of adverse social impact.
Okay, all right. Now can we turn to the topic of AI and ESG? Swetam, how can AI enhance ESG?
Well, there are different ways. Traditionally, ESG and sort of capturing data for ESG has been a very manual process, and it still is. A lot of it is still manually done in terms of data capture and sourcing. And sort of curating the data and standardizing it is costly as well. So AI can come in and really scale and speed up this whole process. So there's certainly, a bright future for AI in ESG in helping develop that sort of data capture process and really expanding it to a much wider market. So, if we can tell the machine to do that on our behalf, we're really going to improve data quality and quantity. So that's one way where ESG can AI can really help in ESG. But on the other hand, ESG today is about what's already happened. What a company has reported. So from when they filled in the survey and filed these numbers and reported it, there's been a gap, from that moment of filling in the survey to reporting it. But with AI, we can, significantly reduce that gap. So from capturing to reporting, we can really come up with, almost real-time view on the ESG profile of that company. So again, that's where AI can really be helpful. And beyond that, sorry, I'm just going to be very quickly on that. Beyond that, AI models can be a forward-looking way to looking at the ESG profile of a company based on its historical impact and behavior. So we have that aspect as well.
Okay, so one level you're talking about effectively automating the collection of data and to eliminate errors, because humans are humans and we make mistakes. And I think that ties in with technologies like robotic process automation, you know, the automation of manual tasks that you would carry out on a computer. It's like a software robot. But then at the other level is actually in the analysis of the data. And I'm kind of thinking ChatGPT here. Could you not sort of put something like ChatGPT on your data and ask it to come up with a report?
Absolutely. So coming up with a report, but also, you know, almost forecasting what else could happen with regards to these metrics that we've captured. So again, kind of a forward-looking ESG profile of companies. So to really preempt and prepare for any eventual, you know, risk posed by the ESG measures.
Okay, one more question. It's the big question. It's the question that we could spend the rest of this month discussing, or we're near the end of the month. We could spend all of next month discussing, but you've got 30 seconds. How much of a threat is AI, and what's that got to do with ESG?
Well, the thing is, you know, integrating AI into ESG is very much like how we integrated cybersecurity risks in ESG, particularly within the governance pillar. So now there has to be a way to quantify and measure the impact of AI within a company, but also externally. How does the application of AI by a company impact society? So these new metrics will add a totally new dimension to how we view and value those companies. Now, about the threat itself, you know, let me be very candid here. We are in big trouble. You know, AI, I think, the threat posed by AI far outweighs climate crisis, because of the social impact of AI is yet to be quantified. And it's not necessarily a direct impact of AI, if you see what I mean. It might be kind of an indirect way how AI influences society, and that's where the danger lies. But anyway, that's yes.
Thank you, Chris. And for what it's worth, I agree. I think AI is incredibly exciting, but it is a bigger threat than climate change. But there's nothing we can do to stop it. It's happening. We can't be like King Canute, who, you know, the English king from 900 or something AD, who commanded the tide to stop but failed. You can't stop AI. It's happening. We have to embrace it, but we have to embrace it in a way that limits the downside somehow. As I say, we could spend the next 6 months discussing this, but we can't. Shelle, over to you. I believe you're chatting to Chris.
Yes, I'd like to welcome back Chris Mentor, who today is going to be discussing the Emperor's new clothes. Now, according to the story, as he walked through the streets amongst the crowds, the Emperor was naked, but the crowd engaged in the illusion until one child pointed out that the Emperor was in fact naked. And then everyone started laughing. So, Chris, who's the Emperor and why is he naked?
Well, the Emperor in our context are the corporations that tell everyone how green they are with a lot of their greenwashing tactics. So there's been a realization in the last year or two that everyone is starting to see through the marketing spin and know that there's nothing underneath. And companies for quite a long time have been happy to announce, you know, green initiatives, platitudes and statements, and, you know, customers and investors are now seeing these statements for what they are. They're just a naked attempt at greenwashing. So they're not really covering up anything anymore. And boards and board members are waking up to the fact that it's not enough just to say stuff. They actually have to do something. And the operating environment has changed. The world has changed, and which is a good thing. So now we're entering the age of action, which is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I'm just interested, you know, what are your thoughts? You know, maybe some people are happy to support the lie. And after all, we have known about climate change for, for decades, and still many people dispute it, don't they?
Yeah. Look, they do, but I think what is happening now is that companies are under pressure from essentially three different areas. So the first is third-party pressure. So investors, suppliers, and customers are all demanding good, accurate, precise reporting on company emissions. Why do they want that? Well, investors need it for their own ESG portfolio requirements. Customers and suppliers need it for their own Scope 3 emissions reporting. They need to include their downstream and upstream suppliers into their own reporting. So there is pressure there that's happening outside of the company for that. Secondly, there is pressure coming from governments and regulatory agencies. So in Australia here, all major companies with that emit over a certain amount of greenhouse gas every year are required by law to submit reporting every year to the National Greenhouse and Energy Register. So that is like a national body, an agency that collects all of this. So that is going on right now. And then also in parallel to this, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, is releasing this quarter the first draft of accounting standards for greenhouse gas emissions. And the implications of that is that once that is released, all the local standards bodies around the world in different countries will adopt it, and all companies will have to report through that framework and that standard. And finally, the third thing that's changing is efficiencies. So companies are waking up that going to net zero isn't just an impost of cost and time. It is a major change, and it's an investment. Definitely an investment. It costs them money, but once they're over that investment hump, the efficiencies are enormous by electrifying their factory, by having fleets of electric cars, by using heat pumps to heat their offices, and using heat in their factory via heat pumps. So that are some examples, but there is major cost savings to be had over time. So companies are seeing the payback is a lot quicker than it would otherwise be if they were using fossil fuels for these types of investments. And then finally, from a revenue perspective, customers want to be transacting with companies that are genuinely reducing their emissions. Not only does it make them feel good, but the most important thing, again, is that if you're buying products from a downstream customer, upstream customer, and selling to a downstream customer, and those companies are reducing their emissions, it impacts on your emissions profile as a company as well via Scope 3. So it's in everyone's interest to deal and transact with companies that are actively reducing their emissions.
Wow, it's absolutely fascinating. It's so, who would, I guess begs the question, who would point out, the lie or discrepancies or whatever, and once it's pointed out, would everybody agree? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, over the last few years, I mean, this is why we are in desperate need of global standards, a single standard, a unifying standard that all carbon accounting can go through. So for the last few years, there's been a number of different standards like the TCFD and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. These organizations have their own standards of reporting and ways of reporting emissions, but we need to get it unified. One way, one approach for everyone. And if we do that, then we can actively measure and monitor what's actually going on around emissions.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I'd agree with that. So, what's changing then? Where are we now? What is changing?
Yeah, so like I said, there is pressure from regulatory bodies, and third-party pressure is all making companies really focus on their reporting requirements for emissions. So that has been the thing that's really changed, and hopefully it'll continue.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. It's absolutely fascinating. It really is, and encouraging as well, I think. So, Michael.
Thank you very much, Chris. We now come to the final segment of the show. Just to warn everybody, via LinkedIn Live. We have a hard stop at 11:50, so we will stop this discussion at that time pretty promptly. We have no choice in the matter. But anyhow, Chris and Swetam will be joining us back in just a second. Our topic today: practical steps in implementing sustainability. So, guys, let's define our terms first. What do we mean by sustainability?
Look, I think there's many different definitions for that, but one I like to use is really sustainability means leaving nothing behind except happy customers. We should be able to do our business without, emitting greenhouse gases, without destroying the planet in the meantime. So for me, that's what's important for around what sustainability is.
You're right, Chris. I mean, there are several definitions, and the one I like to use is the one that looks at current needs. So development that meets current or present needs without compromising future needs. So we're still addressing today's issues and urgencies, but we're not putting at risk the future generations.
Absolutely.
Okay, I mean, sustainability could apply to kind of anything. A company that's making a profit is, from a P&L point of view, is sustainable, but that's not what we're talking about, is it?
Well, there's the argument that you can still, do good and, make a profit. One doesn't need to happen. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive things. So yes, there are ways for this to happen, and there are practical ways for this to happen. But there needs to be a lot of things in place for this to really be viable. We need technology, we need data, we need policies, we need a list of things really for this to happen.
Okay, and a bit of AI to help us, I should think, with Swetam. So, okay, so what's the first step?
Well, for me, it's really start measuring stuff. What gets measured gets managed, as the old saying goes. And I think that if all companies started measuring their emissions, and use consistent standards for doing that, then we're suddenly at the first base. First base is really understanding where you are. So emissions reporting is very much like financial reporting. You have your management pack, which is backward looking to say how the company has gone. That is like your emissions profile as at today. And then your forward forecast and where you want to get to in the future is my plan going forward. So I think planning is very important in this context as well, of really understanding not just a target of zero at some point in the future, but what are my steps to get there over the next 12, 16, 18 months down to that point. So definitely targets, announced targets, adjustments, forecasting, these types of things we can take from the financial context and use in carbon reporting.
And the other thing we have to realize is it's not just the one solution for all. Sustainability is very much dependent on the sector you're in. It's dependent on which part of the world you live in. It's dependent on the size of the economy of the company you're looking at. So there's a list of things, again, that have to be taken into consideration and applied locally. I think the way we used to think of globalization as, having a homogeneous world where everyone's connected, everything's the same for everyone else, that was a utopian, I think. And we kind of missed the kind of real target on that. As opposed to kind of a global world where everyone's connected and was just on the same level. What we need is more of a local focused approach to our economy, our social well-being, and so on. So this approach, while still being connected, obviously, I'm not saying we're going to get rid of the internet or things like that, but thinking of a global growth is actually going against sustainability. We have to think of local and, sort of what's best suited for that particular environment.
Okay, and what's the biggest challenge, do you think?
I think data, it starts with data. Like Chris said, unless we are able to measure and quantify the risks and opportunities, we can't really do anything meaningful. It starts with data.
100%, it's data. And the hardest part of that data right now in terms of the reporting is what's known as scope 3 emissions. So it's understanding the whole value chain of how a product or a service is made, really understanding right back what those emissions are at every single step of the journey. It's nearly impossible. Global supply chains are so complex and span all regions of the world. It's very difficult to track that. So, but that can be addressed by standards, and that can be addressed by governments working together to come up with a solution for this. And if we can do that, that will make life a lot easier for measurement.
Yeah, we already have the SDGs, right? These are like a blueprint to how we can implement these different policies, So we have that. We can start with this. But also, financing is a huge factor to getting it done. From policy to action, you need financing. If you think of the moon landing mission, that was equivalent of 3% of the US's GDP that they put into this program to send people to the moon. 3% of the GDP. And that's all we are asking for, 3% of the global GDP to go into financing these sustainable projects. And that's all we need. But do we have the goodwill, the willpower to do that? That's the question.
3%, did you say, of GDP?
Yes.
3%. So it's not a big ask. Okay, we are running low on time, and we've got one question from the audience which I want to tackle. But 3 words: Swetam, Chris, optimistic, pessimistic?
Yeah, I'm hopeful for the future. I'm seeing a lot of change happening, and I'm really hopeful for the future in sustainability.
I'd like to say I'm optimistic, but I think it will take another shock like we had, the COVID pandemic. You need a shock to the system for us to react. But I'm hopeful that we'll move in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. We've got just about enough time to deal with one question from the audience, which should be appearing on the screen. Hopefully your eyesight's better than mine, Shelle, and you can read that.
Marginally, only marginally. So we've got a question here from Aiden. Sorry, my eyesight isn't much better than yours, Michael. I have to be honest with you. For how practical is this for companies to close their offices and evidently scope 1 and 2 emissions go to 0? However, scope 3 emissions from home office would have tremendous rising levels. Thus, looking at the practicality of this action, would it be manageable to only focus on engraving sustainability and evidently energy efficiency to the company's employees and managing only scope 3 emissions for the company? That's a great question.
And you've got 30 seconds each to answer it.
No pressure.
Goodness me. Okay, really quickly from my side, I think we live in a world of overlaps. So anything you do at home to make your house more efficient, more environmentally friendly, or run off solar, for example, it's going to benefit when you work from home because you not have those emissions anyway. And companies can do the same. The things that they do in their businesses will have an overlap to how people live in their communities.
I agree, 100%. Because everything is ultimately connected. Whatever small steps you take at home or in your neighborhood has a repercussion on the wider society and obviously on the businesses around you. So yes.
Thank you very much, guys. We're out of time. Thank you very much. I'll see you all next week, same time next week, when we're being joined by 2 guests from America and 1 guest from Australia. So bit of a logistics problem sorting that one out. Same time next week. See you then.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.